Inside the closed doors of the Third Army headquarters, the tension is suffocating. General George S. Patton traces a mechanized offensive route on a map, while 30 senior officers watch in absolute silence. Suddenly, the lowest-ranking man in the room raises his hand. 22-year-old Corporal Daniel Kovach says, "Sir, I believe the map is wrong." The stakes in that split second are absolute. If Kovach is mistaken, his military career is instantly over. But if he is right, the silence of those 30 seasoned officers was about to send an entire armored column driving blindly into a disaster. How does a junior enlisted man survive challenging a notoriously explosive general in front of his entire staff? To understand the gravity of that moment, you have to look at the rigid, unforgiving architecture of military command in 1944. In the United States Army, rank is absolute. A corporal does not interrupt the commanding general of the Third Army. For a 22-year-old enlisted man to break the silence of a high-level strategic briefing was, by every conventional standard, an act of professional suicide. The colonels and majors standing in that room fully understood the risks of contradicting a commander famous for his explosive, unpredictable temper. In a hierarchy built on strict compliance, it was always safer to nod, accept the briefing, and let the armored columns deal with the consequences on the ground. But blind military obedience can be fatal. This split-second breach of protocol wasn't just a display of reckless nerve. It was a desperate intervention that stood between a massive mechanized offensive and a crippling logistical collapse during the relentless push across France. It raises two profound questions about leadership and survival in wartime. How did a junior enlisted soldier catch a catastrophic flaw that dozens of seasoned staff officers had completely overlooked? And why did a general notorious for demanding absolute, unquestioning discipline ultimately decide to reward an act of blatant insubordination? To grasp why the air in that command post turned to ice, you have to understand the sheer, terrifying velocity of the Third Army in the late summer of 1944. General George S. Patton did not just move an army, he hurled it across the European continent. His entire operational philosophy was built on relentless, unforgiving momentum, designed to keep the German forces perpetually off balance. For the Third Army, speed was a weapon, and hesitation was quite literally a court-martial offense. But that speed was not spontaneous. A mechanized advance is a fragile, highly volatile mathematical equation. We are talking about orchestrating the movement of hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of M4 Sherman tanks weighing over 30 tons apiece, M3 half-tracks, self-propelled artillery, and a seemingly endless convoy of 2.5-ton supply trucks. The logistics were staggering. A single armored division could consume tens of thousands of gallons of fuel in a single day. To keep this massive beast moving, columns of armor stretching for dozens of miles needed wide, clear arteries. If a vanguard unit halts unexpectedly, the ripple effect paralyzes the entire column for miles backward. Traffic jams in a combat zone are not just logistical inconveniences, they are fatal traps. A stalled armored convoy packed tightly on a narrow country road becomes a static target for German 88mm anti-tank guns and opportunistic Luftwaffe strafing runs. Therefore, the timetable was absolute. The planned route had to be flawless. Every intersection, every stone bridge, and every rural crossroad had to be able to accommodate the immense physical footprint of a mechanized division moving at full tilt. This extreme operational pressure flowed directly from the top. Patton commanded his staff with the exact same aggressive intensity he directed at the Wehrmacht. His headquarters was not a place for collaborative brainstorming or open academic debate. It was an absolute monarchy. Patton's towering physical presence, his immaculate uniform, his highly polished helmet, and his famously explosive temper cultivated an atmosphere of intense psychological pressure. He was known to publicly humiliate officers who failed to meet his exacting standards, stripping men of their commands on the spot for perceived caution or a lack of discipline. Because of this looming threat, a culture of rigid compliance had hardened within his inner circle. In a high-level strategic briefing, the unwritten rule of the United States Army was simple. The commanding general speaks, the staff listens, and the orders are executed without friction. When Patton placed his riding crop or his finger on a situation map and dictated a route, That route instantly became operational gospel. The seasoned colonels and majors lining the walls of the command post had spent decades navigating the treacherous, unspoken politics of the military hierarchy. They were career men. They knew that raising a dissenting voice in front of an audience, especially over a technical detail, was inviting the wrath of a commander who famously despised insubordination. It was always safer to nod, validate the plan, issue the orders down the chain of command, and let the front-line battalion commanders sort out the friction once the tracks hit the mud. The operation laid out on the table that morning was a massive gamble against time. It was a synchronized thrust designed to exploit a rapidly fracturing German defensive line, and the success of this entire sweeping maneuver hinged entirely on a single, vital choke point. A provincial road junction situated in a medium-sized French town along the axis of advance. On the sprawling, acetate-covered situation map pinned to the briefing board, this junction looked perfect. The main departmental roads converged neatly on the outskirts, forming a wide, unobstructed artery that would theoretically allow a heavy armored column to bypass the dense, narrow, medieval center of the town. This bypass was critical to maintain the division's cruising speed. According to the map, the Third Army could funnel thousands of heavy vehicles through this bottleneck without slowing down, maintaining the element of surprise. It was the linchpin of the day's tactical planning. If the armor cleared that junction by dawn, they could outflank retreating German elements, cut off their escape routes, and collapse the sector. It was an elegant, decisive maneuver. On paper, it was absolutely flawless. But the paper was exactly the problem. The sheer speed of the Allied breakout across France had created a severe cartographic nightmare. The front line was advancing so rapidly that forward combat units were literally driving off the edges of their printed maps faster than the Army Map Service in England could supply new ones. To sustain the furious pace of the advance, military planners were forced to rely on whatever topographical intelligence they could scavenge. In many cases, this meant utilizing pre-war French civilian maps, old cadastral surveys, and even tourist road guides, which were hastily copied, overprinted with military coordinate grids, and rushed to the command staff. These maps were beautiful, highly detailed, and completely oblivious to the passage of time. They represented the French countryside exactly as it existed in the mid-1930s, long before the outbreak of hostilities, and more importantly, long before any recent civilian infrastructure updates. The Third Army planners were plotting the movements of a massive, modern, mechanized strike force, using documents that effectively belonged in a pre-war historical archive. The clock for the impending offensive was ticking down to zero. Miles away from the headquarters, fuel trucks were already staged. Tank commanders were waiting for the final coordinates to button up their steel hatches and kick their engines to life. Inside the briefing room, the heavy silence of the senior staff acted as a final, collective stamp of approval on a plan that was fundamentally blind to reality. The Third Army was preparing to hurl millions of pounds of steel at a phantom intersection, betting the momentum of the campaign and the lives of thousands of men on a faded ink line drawn a decade earlier. The collision between the theoretical world of paper maps and the unforgiving reality of concrete and earth was imminent. The invisible trap waiting for them was buried in the mundane details of French civic engineering. Sometime in the late 1930s, long after that baseline military map had been surveyed and printed, the local authorities had completely restructured the town's traffic flow. The vital road junction, the exact spot where Patton intended to pivot thousands of tons of American armor, had been physically demolished and relocated. The actual paved intersection now sat roughly 1.5 kilometers to the southwest. A discrepancy of a single mile might seem trivial on a sprawling strategic map, but for a mechanized column moving at combat speed, it was a death sentence. If the lead elements of the armored spearhead followed the general's route, they would bypass the new junction entirely and drive straight into a dense labyrinth of narrow medieval streets. You cannot simply throw 30-ton Sherman tanks into reverse on a single-lane cobblestone road. The vanguard would immediately grind to a halt. Within minutes, the vehicles behind them would compress, creating a massive, immovable bottleneck stretching for miles back into the French countryside. The momentum of the offensive would instantly evaporate. Engines would idle in the mud, burning through irreplaceable reserves of aviation-grade fuel. Worse, A paralyzed, tightly packed armored column was exactly what the retreating Wehrmacht prayed for. It would provide a stationary, unmissable target for pre-sighted German 88mm artillery batteries and mortar teams just waiting to bleed the American advance. The 30 senior officers staring at the briefing board saw only the clean, authoritative lines of a military overlay. But 22-year-old Corporal Daniel Kovach saw the earth itself. He had not caught this catastrophic error through sheer luck or tactical genius. Before the war pulled him into a uniform, Kovach had worked in civilian drafting and land surveying. He had spent his early life walking actual ground and translating physical topography onto paper. Because of that specific hands-on experience, he possessed a rare, intuitive understanding of how landscapes evolve. Looking closely at the map, he noticed subtle, telling inconsistencies. The way a modernized railway spur failed to align with the older road network, and the unnatural flow of the contour lines near the designated choke point. Kovach understood a fundamental truth that the career officers, blinded by protocol, had forgotten. A printed map is not the physical Earth. It is merely a flawed snapshot of a vanished past. He knew exactly what was waiting for the armor if they took that route, but recognizing a fatal flaw and having the nerve to speak it aloud in the Third Army headquarters were two entirely different things. In that split second, the tactical threat of a German ambush paled in comparison to the immediate psychological danger standing at the front of the room. By opening his mouth, a junior enlisted clerk was actively contradicting the operational orders of a commanding general. The heavy silence in the command post stretched out, suffocating and absolute. The fate of the offensive had suddenly shifted from the battlefields of France to the terrifying politics of this frozen room. 30 colonels and majors turned their heads, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief, fully expecting a brutal, career-ending reprimand to shatter the quiet. At the front of the briefing board, General George Patton slowly stopped tracing the route, lowered his hand, and turned his piercing gaze directly onto the 22-year-old corporal whose hand was still suspended in the cold air. The air in the headquarters instantly calcified. For the 30 colonels, majors, and senior staff officers lining the perimeter of the room, time seemed to grind to a complete and terrifying halt. You could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a field clock against the canvas wall, cutting through a silence so absolute it felt physical. Every man standing in that command post knew exactly what happened when George S. Patton was challenged. This was a commander who operated on a razor's edge of aggressive momentum, a man who viewed any hesitation, let alone outright contradiction from a subordinate, as a personal affront to his authority and to the uniform itself. The senior officers instinctively braced themselves. They pulled their shoulders back, creating a microscopic psychological distance between themselves and the 22-year-old corporal, fully expecting a legendary, career-ending detonation to shatter the morning quiet. Patton's temper was not just a rumor traded among enlisted men. It was a well-documented force of nature that had famously derailed his own career trajectory in Sicily the year prior. To speak out of turn in his presence was dangerous. To tell him his operational blueprint was fundamentally flawed was considered tantamount to professional suicide. In the minds of the seasoned staff officers, Corporal Daniel Kovach was already a ghost. They waited for the inevitable screaming, the brutal public humiliation, the immediate demand for court-martial paperwork. The sheer audacity of a junior enlisted man, a clerk whose primary function was to fetch coffee, sort files, and update grease pencil overlays, interrupting a theater-level strategic briefing, defied every established doctrine of military etiquette. The colonels, who had spent decades meticulously climbing the rigid, unforgiving ladder of the United States Army hierarchy, stared at the corporal with a mixture of profound horror and morbid fascination. They knew the map pinned to the board was gospel. They had signed off on it. If Kovach was wrong, he was a fool who would be systematically destroyed. But if Kovach was somehow right, his intervention was a direct, glaring indictment of their own collective incompetence. The silence stretched. It was a suffocating, heavy dread, the kind of quiet that precedes a massive artillery barrage. Kovach stood frozen, his hand slowly lowering to his side, the sudden, terrifying realization of what he had just done washing over him like ice water. He was a speck of dust in a room full of stars, and the supreme commander of the Third Army was looking at him with pale eyes that had stared down Rommel's panzers in North Africa. Patton did not yell. He did not slam his fist onto the briefing table. He did not reach for the famous ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist. Instead, the general simply stared. It was an extended, agonizing period of total visual lock. Patton's piercing gaze bore into the young corporal, analyzing him with the exact same predatory calculation he reserved for probing a weakness in the German defensive line. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an hour in the claustrophobic confines of the command post. The senior staff held their breath, their eyes darting nervously between the imposing, immaculate frame of the general and the rigid, terrified posture of the young enlisted man. Patton's face was an unreadable mask of hardened leather and absolute command discipline. He shifted his weight, his highly polished cavalry boots creaking audibly against the wooden floorboards. That sound, the slow, deliberate shift of leather in a dead-silent room, sent a visible tremor through the gathered staff. The men who knew Patton best understood a terrifying truth. His silences were often far more dangerous than his shouting. A screaming Patton was a force you could weather. A silent Patton was a man calculating a devastating, precise strike. The general took one slow step away from the acetate-covered map board. He did not break eye contact with Kovach for a fraction of a second. The psychological pressure in the room was absolute, a crushing weight pressing down on the shoulders of a 22-year-old who suddenly felt the unbearable absence of rank on his sleeves. And then, breaking a silence that felt like it had lasted an eternity, Patton finally spoke. His voice was not the high-pitched, abrasive bark that usually accompanied his famous reprimands. It was dangerously calm, remarkably low, and entirely devoid of emotion. He issued a simple, two-word command that echoed off the canvas walls. "Show me." It was an invitation, but to everyone in the room, it felt exactly like a trap. It was the ultimate, uncompromising test. The commanding general was offering the young corporal the rope to either save the vanguard of an entire armored division or to hang himself in front of the highest command echelon in the European theater. Kovach swallowed hard. His mouth was completely dry, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his palms sweating against the fabric of his trousers. But military training, or perhaps the sheer, ingrained instinct of a man who intimately knew his civilian craft, took over. He stepped forward out of the shadows at the edge of the room. As he walked toward the center of the command post, the sea of senior officers reluctantly parted for him, treating the corporal as though he were carrying a live, unpinned grenade. He approached the massive briefing table, coming to stand shoulder to shoulder with General Patton. The visual contrast was staggering. The immaculate, towering legend of the Third Army, draped in polished brass and stars, standing next to a slightly rumpled corporal whose uniform still smelled of mimeograph ink and stale coffee. Kovach looked down at the map. This was no longer a battlefield of generals and sweeping strategic maneuvers. This was a battlefield of pure geometry, of contour lines, elevation gradients, and civic infrastructure. And on this specific battlefield, the former civilian surveyor held the absolute high ground. He raised his hand, his index finger trembling slightly before he forced it steady by sheer willpower, and pressed it against the glossy surface of the acetate overlay. "Right here, sir," Kovach said, his voice surprisingly clear in the deadly quiet room. He pointed to the elegant converging lines of the road network on the outskirts of the designated French town. The military overlay shows a unified, multi-lane junction here, at the eastern edge of the commune. But if you look past the grease pencil, at the underlying topographical logic of the base map, the elevation markers simply do not support the road gradient required for heavy industrial transport. He moved his finger slightly to the north, tracing a faint, almost invisible line printed in the faded ink of the original survey. "This is a secondary railway spur, sir. In the mid-1930s, the French Ministry of Public Works initiated a massive grade separation project throughout this entire region. They were trying to prevent the exact kind of rail crossing bottlenecks that plague rural infrastructure." Kovach was no longer a corporal speaking to a four-star general. He was a professional surveyor explaining a flawed blueprint to a client. The hesitation vanished completely as he leaned deeper into the raw data. "They tore up this intersection entirely, sir. They rerouted the main departmental highway to bypass the railway lines. The new junction, the one made of poured concrete, the one that can actually support the ground pressure of a 30-ton Sherman tank, is a mile and a half to the southwest, down in this valley." He tapped a seemingly empty patch of green on the map, a spot devoid of any military markings. "This intersection on the board doesn't exist anymore. It is a ghost. If the armored spearhead drives to these exact coordinates, they will find nothing but a dead-end dirt embankment and the medieval center of the old town square. They will not be able to turn around. The senior officers stared at the map in stunned, paralyzed silence. Kovach had just systematically dismantled the operational centerpiece of the Third Army's daily advance, using nothing but civil engineering history and the microscopic analysis of contour intervals. He had seen the invisible physical reality hidden beneath the bold, colorful lines of arrogant military planning. To truly understand the sheer scale of the catastrophe Kovach was desperately trying to avert, you have to shift the perspective 15 miles to the east, to the damp, muddy fields surrounding the actual physical road junction. While the American staff officers debated faded lines on paper inside a secure tent, elements of the German Wehrmacht were actively digging into the real earth. The defenders waiting at the choke point were not second-line conscripts. They were a patched-together Kampfgruppe, a lethal battle group of battle-hardened Panzergrenadiers and veteran anti-tank crews who understood the geography of the French countryside intimately. They were fully aware that Patton's mechanized juggernaut was barreling toward their sector. They also knew, with cold tactical certainty, that they could not defeat the Third Army in an open, mobile fight. Their entire defensive doctrine at this stage of the war was based on bleeding the Americans, fracturing their momentum, and turning the rapid armored advance into a grinding, brutal slog. And to execute that doctrine, they relied exclusively on choke points. The German commander in the sector had studied the exact same terrain, but he didn't care about outdated maps printed in London. He cared about the asphalt, the concrete, and the sight lines under his boots. He had positioned his remaining forces in a crescent around the new 1930s-era junction, the exact junction completely missing from the American briefing board. Concealed within the dense, ancient hedgerows and reinforced stone farmhouses overlooking the approach, a battery of fearsome 88mm Flak 36 guns had been lowered and camouflaged. Their long barrels were perfectly leveled to cover the exact angle of the real intersection, their optical sights dialed into the exact distance of the concrete roadway. Heavy machine gun nests, armed with rapid-fire MG-42s, were staggered in a lethal crossfire pattern designed to sweep the pavement, while infantry teams, armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, waited in deep, muddy trenches concealed by brush. It was an interlocking kill zone of terrifying efficiency, maintained with absolute sound and light discipline. The Germans were waiting for the American tanks to funnel blindly into the bottleneck, where their superior numbers, speed, and maneuverability would be instantly neutralized by the restricted terrain. But there was a darker, even more lethal irony unfolding on the battlefield. The Germans were defending the real choke point. They had absolutely no idea that a cartographic error was about to deliver the Americans directly into a completely different, far more devastating trap of their own making. If the Third Army vanguard had followed the flawed map approved by the colonels, they would have completely bypassed the German ambush at the new junction, only to wedge themselves tightly into the impossibly narrow, inescapable cobblestone streets of the old town center. Once the lead tanks became physically stuck between the stone buildings, the column would have compressed. The Germans would have simply realized the American mistake, repositioned their mobile artillery and mortar teams to the high ground surrounding the town, and systematically annihilated the trapped column from a safe distance. The American armor would have been entirely paralyzed, unable to advance through the narrow alleys, unable to reverse miles of tightly packed vehicles, burning through aviation fuel and ammunition while trapped in a stone maze. Thousands of men and hundreds of irreplaceable machines would have been fed into a slaughterhouse created not by enemy brilliance, but by outdated ink on a piece of paper. Back in the suffocating silence of the Third Army command post, the fate of those thousands of men hung delicately suspended between the tip of a corporal's trembling finger and the steely, unblinking gaze of General Patton. The silence had returned to the room, somehow heavier and more oppressive than before. The senior staff held their collective breath, the reality of the near miss washing over them. The senior colonel who had initially briefed the route looked physically ill, the color completely drained from his face, as the undeniable, concrete logic of Kovach's topographical analysis settled over the briefing table. The flaw was real, the danger was absolute, and it had taken a 22-year-old enlisted clerk to see what dozens of field-grade officers had missed. Patton slowly leaned his massive frame over the briefing table. He placed his hands flat on the edges of the board, casting a long, dark shadow over the acetate map. He did not look at Kovach. He did not look at his terrified staff officers. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, squinting at the tiny, almost illegible text printed in the extreme bottom right corner of the base map. He was checking the publication date and the cartographic source code. For several long, agonizing seconds, the only sound in the headquarters was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 30 highly anxious men. Patton read the date. He mentally processed the topographical logic Kovach had laid out. He calculated the devastating tactical implications of the error, visualizing the inevitable traffic jam and the resulting artillery slaughter. Then, the commanding general of the United States Third Army stood up to his full height. He adjusted the leather belt at his waist, looked briefly at the senior colonel in charge of divisional planning, and then turned his eyes back to the map. He did not scream. He did not throw his riding crop. He did not publicly humiliate the officers who had nearly marched an armored division into a geographic dead end. He simply stated, in a calm, authoritative voice that carried a chilling weight to every corner of the room, "He's right." The tension in the air shattered instantly, replaced by a frantic, immediate surge of controlled panic. Patton pointed his riding crop at the map, sharply tapping the empty green space Kovach had identified as the real, modern junction. "Reroute the spearhead. Shift the axis of advance 1.5 miles to the southwest. Get on the radio to the armored cavalry commanders right now. Update the coordinates before the lead elements cross the departure line." The command post erupted into frantic, quiet efficiency. The catastrophic threat to the armored column had been neutralized in a matter of seconds. The operational route was immediately and quietly corrected, without any further public scene. There were no apologies from the general, no grand speeches about the importance of accurate topography, and certainly no immediate reward or acknowledgement for the young corporals standing awkwardly by the table. The war simply moved forward, relentless, mechanical, and unforgiving. As the senior officers scrambled to issue the new orders over the encrypted radio nets, Kovach quietly took a step back, retreating into the shadows at the edge of the room, where he belonged. He had survived the immediate, terrifying confrontation. He had utilized his civilian knowledge to save the vanguard of the Third Army from driving blindly into a meat grinder. But as the briefing abruptly concluded, and the officers rapidly dispersed into the damp French morning to execute the revised plan, a cold, heavy dread began to settle deep in the pit of Kovach's stomach. He had committed the ultimate, unforgivable sin of the rigid military hierarchy. He had publicly embarrassed a room full of senior commanders and actively corrected a famously volatile general in front of his entire staff. The immediate tactical crisis on the battlefield was solved, but the professional fallout of his blatant breach of protocol remained terrifyingly ambiguous. The absolute silence from Patton regarding Kovach's fate was deafening, leaving the young corporal standing alone in the command post to wonder if he had just traded the lives of an armored division for the abrupt, brutal end of his own military existence. To understand why the hammer didn't immediately fall on Daniel Kovach, you have to strip away the mythology surrounding George S. Patton and look at the deeply contradictory nature of the man himself. Patton was a highly controversial, deeply flawed commander. His well-documented history of mistreating shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily had nearly ended his career, and his blistering ego often fostered an environment of absolute terror within his own command posts. He demanded a level of rigid compliance that frequently crossed into tyranny. But beneath the polished brass and the ivory-handled revolvers, Patton was also a ruthless, calculating pragmatist. In the quiet aftermath of that morning briefing, the general was processing a terrifying realization. The cartographic error was a severe logistical failure, but it wasn't the true danger. The real threat to the Third Army was the silence that had preceded Kovach's interruption. Patton knew that among the dozens of seasoned colonels and majors in that room, at least a few had to have harbored their own private doubts about the route. Yet they had been so paralyzed by the fear of his legendary temper that they were willing to let a mechanized spearhead drive blindly into a fatal bottleneck rather than risk their own careers by speaking up. For Patton, this was a chilling indictment of his own command climate. He understood that extreme discipline is worse than useless if it blinds an army to physical reality. A general surrounded by terrified yes-men is a general fighting in the dark. The true value of what Kovach had done went far beyond his background in civilian surveying or his sharp eye for topographical inconsistencies. The 22-year-old corporal had demonstrated an incredibly rare form of moral courage. He had willingly stepped into the line of fire, risking a brutal court-martial to tell an explosive commander a deeply uncomfortable truth. Patton realized that the senior officers who had stayed silent out of self-preservation were a far greater liability to his offensive momentum than an enlisted man breaking military protocol. The general knew he could not simply let the morning's events fade into the routine chaos of the war. He needed to send a deliberate, unmistakable message to every field-grade officer on his staff, one that would shatter the culture of sycophancy that had quietly taken root in his headquarters. He had to show them exactly what actual battlefield loyalty looked like. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the 3rd Army headquarters remained thick with unresolved tension. The senior staff officers arrived expecting the delayed detonation. They assumed the paperwork for a court-martial or a punitive transfer was already being typed up for the young clerk. Instead, the bureaucratic machinery of the United States Army delivered a profound shock to the system. There was no grand ceremony, there was no public speech, no formal formation in the muddy French courtyard, and absolutely no verbal praise from General Patton himself. That was not how the 3rd Army operated. The message was delivered with cold administrative efficiency. A personnel officer dropped a small envelope onto Kovach's drafting table and walked away. Inside were 3 freshly issued chevrons, overnight, with a single signature from the commanding general. Corporal Daniel Kovach had been officially promoted to the rank of sergeant. In the hyper-stratified world of the 1944 military, an on-the-spot promotion following an act of blatant public insubordination defied every established doctrine of command. But the promotion was never really about the stripes themselves. It was a calculated, undeniable psychological weapon deployed directly against the seasoned field-grade officers who had lined the walls the day before. As the news of the promotion quietly rippled through the command post, the colonels and majors realized exactly what Patton had done. He had deliberately elevated the lowest-ranking man in the room, the only man who had possessed the nerve to prioritize the physical reality of the mission over his own personal safety. By putting those stripes on Kovach's sleeves, Patton was making a glaringly public statement to his entire command echelon. He was declaring that in a mechanized war defined by speed and absolute precision, accuracy and initiative would always outrank sycophancy. The unwritten rule of silent, blind obedience had just been completely shattered. The men who had chosen the safety of silence over the danger of the truth were left to reflect on their own cowardice, while the clerk who risked everything was rewarded. For the newly minted sergeant standing at his drafting table, the sudden elevation in status did not fundamentally alter the terrifying reality of the war. Kovach did not celebrate. He did not boast to the enlisted men, and he did not seek out the general to offer his thanks. He simply stared at the 3 chevrons resting on the table for a long moment, processing the surreal weight of his survival. Then, he looked up at the duty officer who had delivered the envelope. Kovach asked only one question. He wanted to know if the armored cavalry units had confirmed the new coordinates on the radio net. Once he was assured that the spearhead had safely bypassed the phantom intersection, the 22-year-old sergeant pinned the stripes to his uniform, picked up his grease pencils, and quietly went back to mapping the treacherous geography of France. For the newly promoted Sergeant Kovach, the sudden elevation in status was entirely secondary to the physical reality on the ground. He did not take a moment to celebrate, nor did he boast to his peers about staring down one of the most intimidating commanders in modern military history. His immediate and only response was to verify that the theoretical argument in the briefing room had translated into actual movement. He demanded confirmation that the offensive route had been physically corrected in the final marching orders. Only when the radio net reported that the armored cavalry was successfully rolling through the modern bypass to the southwest, completely avoiding the medieval choke point, did the tension finally leave his shoulders. Satisfied that the mechanized column was safe from the phantom junction, Kovach smoothed out the next acetate overlay on his drafting table and sat right back down to review the upcoming sector. This quiet, professional return to duty perfectly encapsulates why the Allied logistical machines succeeded in Europe. The victory was not forged solely by the industrial weight of tanks pouring out of American factories, nor was it won exclusively by the aggressive momentum of top generals. It was won because, beneath a strict and unforgiving military hierarchy, the system retained enough flexibility to allow pure competence to override ego at the critical moment. While authoritarian regimes frequently punished the bearers of inconvenient truths, the Allied command structure proved capable of yielding to the brutal honesty of the physical world. A massive offensive was successfully diverted simply because a 22-year-old former civilian surveyor refused to let rank dictate geography. Kovach understood that the war was not won by dramatic confrontations in canvas command posts, but by the relentless, unglamorous pursuit of accuracy. He picked up his grease pencil, adjusted his desk lamp, and began studying the elevation contours for the next day's advance, ensuring that the Third Army would only fight on ground that actually existed. In the end, an army where a commander only ever hears pleasant answers will inevitably march down a road that no longer exists. The illusion of perfect obedience quickly becomes a fatal trap when it finally collides with the unforgiving physical reality of a mechanized war. True military discipline is not about maintaining a comfortable, unquestioning silence before superior rank, but about having the unyielding nerve to demand absolute accuracy in the face of danger, knowing that one unspoken truth can cost thousands of lives.